September 7, 1944, 7:40 p.m., the White House, Washington, D.C. The only sound in the Oval Office was the rasp of a fountain pen moving across heavy presidential stationery. Franklin Delano Roosevelt sat behind his desk, a cigarette holder clenched between his teeth, his hand steady despite the fatigue that had long since ceased to surprise him. Polio had taken the use of his legs more than 20 years earlier. Since then, heart disease and the relentless strain of directing a global war had worn him down further. But tonight, the President of the United States was not tired. He was angry. Spread across his desk were 3 decoded telegrams, each stamped with the highest level of security clearance. They had arrived from 3rd Army headquarters in France over previous 10 days, relayed through the War Department in Washington. All 3 bore the unmistakable signature of Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr., America's most brilliant battlefield commander and its most troublesome one. And every one of them contained language that sent Roosevelt's blood pressure climbing with each rereading. The first telegram, dated August 28, addressed the strategic situation in northeastern France. Buried in its 3rd paragraph was a single sentence that had immediately caught the attention of Army Chief of Staff George C. Marshall. Canadian forces assigned to the northern flank are proving inadequate to mission requirements and should be replaced with American units if operational tempo is to be maintained. The second message, sent on September 1st, dispensed with subtlety altogether. The Canadian Army's failure to close the Falaise Gap demonstrates fundamental deficiencies in leadership and combat effectiveness. Recommend future operations minimize reliance on Commonwealth forces, whose performance continues to disappoint. The 3rd telegram, dated September 5th, was the one that finally compelled Marshall to carry the issue directly to the president. In Patton's trademark bluntness, it read, "The Canadians are proving useless in exploitation operations. They lack the aggressive spirit and mobile warfare capability necessary for pursuit. Suggest their sector be assumed by American forces who can actually accomplish the mission. Useless." Patton had used the word in official communications to the War Department, applied to the Army of America's closest ally, a nation that had been at war with Hitler since September 1939, nearly 3 years before Pearl Harbor brought the United States into the conflict. Roosevelt finished writing his reply, set down his pen, and reread the page. He nodded once, satisfied, then reached for the telephone. "Get me General Marshall at the War Department," he said. Immediately. This is not merely a story about military disagreements. It is a story of what happens when America's most celebrated general allows ego and prejudice to eclipse diplomatic necessity. It is the story of how Franklin Roosevelt, a master politician who understood coalition warfare better than many of his commanders, confronted a crisis that threatened the unity of the Allied cause. And it is a story of what Roosevelt said, both publicly and privately, when faced with Patton's contempt for Canadian soldiers who were dying by the thousands to liberate Europe. What Roosevelt said would determine whether the Allied coalition endured or fractured. It would shape the relationship between the United States and Canada for the remainder of the war and long after the guns fell silent. And it would teach Patton and every other American commander that political warfare could matter as much as victories won on the battlefield. This is a story of how a president defended allies his general dismissed, and in doing so, preserved a coalition that would ultimately win the war. To understand Roosevelt's reaction to Patton's telegrams, one must first understand the state of the U.S.-Canadian relationship in September 1944. Canada had entered the Second World War in September 1939, 1 week after Britain. For 2 years, Canada fought while America stood aside. Canadian factories produced weapons. Canadian farms fed Britain. Canadian soldiers trained for an invasion that had yet to come. By the time the United States entered the war in December 1941, Canada was already a hardened combatant, with 3 divisions deployed overseas and a fully mobilized military-industrial economy. By September 1944, Canada's contribution to the Allied war effort was immense. The 1st Canadian Army, 2 corps comprising 5 divisions, was fighting in northwest Europe. Canadian troops had landed at Juno Beach on D-Day, achieving one of the most successful breakthroughs of the invasion. They fought through the hedgerows of Normandy, enduring casualty rates that would have shattered less resilient formations. The Royal Canadian Air Force flew thousands of sorties. The Royal Canadian Navy guarded Atlantic convoys. Canadian factories produced trucks, shells, aircraft, everything a modern war demanded. For a nation of just 11 million people, Canada was carrying a disproportionate share of the burden. Franklin Roosevelt understood this. He understood it because he thought not only in terms of divisions and firepower, but in alliances and obligations. He knew that Canada's value could not be measured solely in tanks or troop numbers, but in political commitment and shared sacrifice. And he knew that dismissing Canadian forces as useless was not merely inaccurate, it was diplomatically disastrous. George Patton did not understand any of this. Patton was a warrior, not a diplomat. He measured success in terms of speed, momentum, and objectives taken. To him, war was a problem to be solved through aggressive movement and relentless pressure. And in early September 1944, he was deeply frustrated. His Third Army had torn across France at a breathtaking pace, advancing hundreds of miles in a matter of weeks. German units had been smashed, towns and cities liberated in rapid succession. To Patton, it seemed like vindication of everything he believed about mobile warfare. But now the advance was slowing, and not, in his view, because of the enemy. It was logistics that had caught up with him. Fuel shortages were crippling his armored units. Trucks were breaking down. Supply lines stretched all the way back to the beaches of Normandy, hundreds of miles behind the front. And to Patton's north, the 1st Canadian Army was engaged in a hard, grinding fight to clear the Channel ports. Ports whose capture was essential to solving the very supply crisis that was halting Patton's drive east. The Canadians were not moving quickly enough for Patton's taste. They advanced methodically, clearing fortified positions street by street, port by port, absorbing heavy casualties in brutal urban combat. To Patton, this looked like excessive caution. It looked like hesitation. Worse, it looked like obstruction. In his mind, the Canadians were holding up the entire Allied advance. What he did not see, or chose not to see, was that the Canadians were fighting in some of the worst terrain in northwest Europe against determined, well-entrenched German defenders. He did not acknowledge that clearing fortified ports required fundamentally different tactics than racing armored columns across open countryside. He saw only that his own momentum had stalled, while others fought battles he considered unnecessary. And so Patton did what he always did when frustrated. He spoke his mind, never inclined to temper his opinions. He began sending telegrams to Washington. Officially, they were meant to be operational assessments, feedback from a field commander to the War Department. In reality, there were also expressions of Patton's ego, his prejudices, and his deep-seated belief that American forces were inherently superior to all others. When General George C. Marshall received the third telegram, the one in which Patton described Canadian forces as useless, he immediately grasped the danger. Marshall was not only the Army Chief of Staff, he was Roosevelt's most trusted military advisor. He understood coalition warfare not just as a military necessity, but as a political balancing act. He knew that if Patton's words ever became public, or even reached Canadian officials, the result would be a diplomatic catastrophe. That evening, September 7th, Marshall brought the telegrams to the White House. The two men met alone in the Oval Office. Marshall explained the situation carefully. "Mr. President, we have a problem with General Patton." Roosevelt, who had dealt with Patton's controversies before, let out a tired sigh. "What has George done now?" Marshall handed him the 3 telegrams. Roosevelt read them slowly, his expression growing darker with each page. When he finished, he looked up. "George has called the Canadians useless," he said quietly. "The Canadians who landed at Juno Beach. The Canadians fighting through the Channel ports. The Canadians who have been at war 3 years longer than we have. He called them useless." Marshall nodded. "Sir, General Patton is frustrated by his supply situation. He believes Canadian operations in the North are too slow and are preventing him from exploiting his successes. In my judgment, his assessment is tactically narrow and politically tone-deaf. Roosevelt was silent for a long moment. Then he asked the question that mattered most. Do the Canadians know about these telegrams? Marshall shook his head. No, sir. They are classified communications from a field commander to the War Department. The Canadians have not been informed. If they were, it would create a serious diplomatic crisis. Prime Minister King would be justifiably outraged. The Canadian military would feel betrayed. Our alliance would be strained at a critical moment. Roosevelt decided immediately. These telegrams are to be sealed under the highest classification, he said. No copies, no distribution. They are to be treated as if they never existed. Is that clear? Yes, Mr. President. And George will receive a message from me. Personal, direct, not through normal channels. He needs to understand that his responsibility is not only to win battles, but to preserve the coalition that makes victory possible. Roosevelt paused and added, George is a brilliant battlefield commander, but he is also a diplomatic liability. This is not the first time his mouth has caused problems, and it won't be the last. But he must understand that there are limits to what I will tolerate. Insulting our allies in official communications crosses that line. Marshall nodded. Sir, what would you like me to convey to General Patton? Roosevelt did not hesitate. Tell George that I have read his telegrams. Tell him that I profoundly disagree with his assessment of Canadian forces. Tell him that his comments about our Canadian allies are inappropriate, inaccurate, and unwelcome. And tell him that if he cannot show proper respect for Commonwealth forces in his communications, he will be relieved of command, regardless of his battlefield successes. It was an extraordinary warning. Roosevelt was prepared to risk losing America's most famous general over a political failure rather than a military one. It underscored how seriously he regarded the alliance with Canada. Marshall left the Oval Office with clear instructions, but Roosevelt's response did not end there. Over the next hour, the president drafted a personal letter to Patton. It would not pass through official military channels. Instead, it would be carried to France by a State Department courier and delivered directly to 3rd Army headquarters. The letter was marked personal and confidential, to be read by the addressee alone. No copies of the letter were ever made after Patton read it. The original was destroyed exactly as Roosevelt had ordered, yet the contents did not vanish with the paper. Years later, historians reconstructed the letter from Patton's diary entries and from accounts provided by staff officers who witnessed his reaction when it arrived at 3rd Army headquarters. Roosevelt's message to Patton was brief, but devastating. It opened with measured praise. The president acknowledged Patton's role in the breakout from Normandy and the astonishing speed of 3rd Army's advance across France. Roosevelt recognized Patton's battlefield brilliance and the results he had achieved. Then the tone shifted abruptly. However, General, the letter continued. I must address recent communications you have sent to the War Department regarding Canadian forces. Roosevelt quoted Patton's language back to him, noting that he had characterized America's Canadian allies as useless and implied that their operations were obstructing American success. This assessment is not merely tactically questionable, Roosevelt wrote. It is politically unacceptable. The letter grew sharper with every line. Canada has been in this war since September 1939. Canadian soldiers were fighting and dying while the United States remained at peace. Canadian factories were arming Britain when American factories were still producing automobiles. The Canadian people have made sacrifices that few American communities have yet experienced. To describe such an ally as useless reflects a failure to understand the nature of coalition warfare and the political responsibilities that accompany command. Then came what amounted to a direct order. You will cease making disparaging remarks about Canadian or any other allied forces in your official communications. You will remember that your responsibility is not limited to commanding American troops, but extends to cooperating with allied forces in pursuit of common objectives. Should you find yourself unable to meet this requirement, I will appoint a commander who can. The letter ended with Roosevelt's signature and a postscript written in a more personal hand. George, I need you to win battles, but I also need you to help me win the peace. The relationships we build with our allies now will shape the post-war world. Do not damage those relationships with intemperate words born of temporary frustration. When Patton received the letter on September 12th, he was stunned. Over the course of the war, Patton had sent hundreds of blunt, often abrasive messages to Washington. Never before had the President of the United States intervened personally. Patton's diary entry for that day captured both his irritation and his comprehension of the stakes. Received blistering letter from FDR regarding my comments about Canadians. President appears unaware of operational realities and overly concerned with political niceties rather than military effectiveness. However, message is clear. I am to praise Canadians publicly regardless of my private assessment. Politics trumps truth, it seems. The entry revealed that Patton had not fundamentally changed his opinion of Canadian forces, but it also showed that he understood something more important. Roosevelt was serious. The threat to relieve him of command was real. Patton valued his position and his legacy, too much to risk it over ill-considered telegrams. But Roosevelt was not content merely to reign in his most troublesome general. He also moved quickly to ensure that no damage, real or perceived, would be done to the relationship with Canada. On September 14th, Roosevelt sent a personal message to Canadian Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King. It was delivered by the American ambassador to Canada in person. The message was carefully crafted. Roosevelt praised Canada's contributions in precise detail: the landings at Juno Beach, the brutal fighting in Normandy, the sacrifices endured by Canadian formations in the Channel ports. He expressed his personal gratitude, and that of the American people, for Canada's steadfast commitment. Crucially, the message made no mention of Patton or his telegrams. King never learned of them. Instead, Roosevelt was quietly establishing a clear public record of American respect and appreciation, political insulation in case Patton's remarks ever surfaced. In a subsequent conversation with Secretary of State Cordell Hull, Roosevelt explained his reasoning. "Cordell, we cannot allow our generals to undermine our alliances," he said. "Patton is a great battlefield commander, but he is also a political liability. I've dealt with his controversies before. The soldier-slapping incident nearly ended his career. These comments about the Canadians could have done the same kind of damage." Hull asked whether Roosevelt believed Patton truly understood the political dimension of his role. Roosevelt laughed bitterly. "George understands only what he chooses to understand. He sees himself as a warrior above politics. He fails to grasp that everything in this war is political, where we fight, when we fight, who we fight with. The Canadians are not simply units to be graded on combat efficiency. They are the representatives of a sovereign nation that chose to stand with us. That choice has value beyond battlefield statistics." This exchange, recorded in Hull's memoirs published in 1948, revealed both Roosevelt's sophisticated grasp of coalition warfare and his frustration with commanders who lacked it. In the weeks that followed, Roosevelt monitored Patton's communications closely. Telegrams from 3rd Army headquarters continued to arrive in Washington, but none contained further disparaging references to Canadian forces. Patton had learned his lesson, or at least learned to keep his opinions out of official correspondence. At the same time, Roosevelt took steps to educate other American commanders. In late September, he hosted a dinner at the White House for senior officers recently returned from Europe. During the meal, he deliberately steered the conversation toward coalition warfare. "Gentlemen," Roosevelt said, "I want to talk about our allies, particularly the Canadians. I am concerned that some American officers do not fully appreciate what Canada has contributed to this war. Let me share a few facts that may put things in perspective." And with that, the president began turning a private crisis into a broader lesson, one he believed the American military could not afford to ignore. Roosevelt then delivered what amounted to a carefully constructed lecture on Canadian sacrifice. He reminded the assembled officers that Canada had mobilized a higher percentage of its population than the United States. He cited casualty figures that proportionally exceeded American losses. He spoke of Canadian industrial production, of food shipments that sustained Britain, of financial contributions that strained a far smaller economy. One by one, he dismantled the notion that Canada was a secondary participant in the war. The point, gentlemen, Roosevelt concluded, is that Canada is not a minor partner in this conflict. It is a major contributor whose efforts merit respect and gratitude. Any American officer who fails to show that respect is failing in his duty, regardless of his accomplishments on the battlefield. Multiple officers present that evening later recorded the exchange in diaries and memoirs. The dinner conversation revealed Roosevelt using every available forum to reinforce the political lesson Patton had ignored. Coalition warfare required not only military competence, but diplomatic discipline. The issue resurfaced publicly in October 1944, when Roosevelt faced a related and potentially more dangerous challenge. Republican presidential candidate Thomas Dewey, mounting a serious campaign against the incumbent president, began attacking Roosevelt's conduct of the war. One line of criticism focused on Allied coordination. Dewey suggested that Roosevelt had allowed British and Canadian forces to avoid their fair share of the fighting, implying that American soldiers were dying while Commonwealth armies advanced too cautiously. The charge was politically potent. It was an election year. American casualties were mounting. The war appeared endless. And Dewey's rhetoric resonated with voters who were exhausted and desperate for victory. Roosevelt could have deflected the criticism by accepting its premise. He could have quietly echoed Patton's complaints and shifted blame onto Allied forces. Politically, it would have been an easier path. He chose the opposite. In a major campaign speech delivered in New York on October 21st, Roosevelt publicly defended Britain and Canada. "I have heard suggestions from my opponent that our allies are not carrying their weight in this war," he told crowd. "Let me address that falsehood directly. The British have been fighting Hitler since September 1939. The Canadians have been in this war since that same month. They fought while we were at peace. They bled while we were safe. And now that we fight together, they continue to sacrifice at rates that equal or exceed our own." Roosevelt went on to cite specifics. Canadian troops, he noted, achieved one of the most successful breakthroughs on D-Day at Juno Beach. They were fighting to the Channel ports in vicious urban battles that cost lives, but opened supply routes essential to Allied success. In recent months, Canadian casualty rates ranked among the highest of any Allied force. To suggest that they are not carrying their share, Roosevelt said, is not only false, it is an insult to men who are dying for freedom. The speech received wide coverage in both American and Canadian newspapers. Major Canadian publications reprinted it in full. The immediate political effect was to blunt Republican attacks on Allied cooperation. The deeper significance, however, was Roosevelt's willingness to expend political capital to defend allies when it might have been expedient to scapegoat them. The response from Canada was swift and heartfelt. Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King sent Roosevelt a personal letter of thanks. "Your words have deeply moved the Canadian people," King wrote. "To know that our sacrifices are recognized and valued by the President of the United States strengthens our resolve in this common cause. We fight not for praise, but for victory. Still, it is gratifying to know that our efforts are understood." The exchange further strengthened the Roosevelt-King relationship and, by extension, the American-Canadian alliance. It also served as an unmistakable rebuke to Patton. Roosevelt's position on Canadian forces was not merely private guidance. It was public policy. By November 1944, the immediate crisis had passed. Patton continued to command Third Army with distinction. Canadian forces fought effectively in their sector. The alliance held. But Roosevelt had not forgotten the episode. In a November meeting with General Marshall and Secretary of War Henry Stimson, Roosevelt returned to the issue. "George Henry," he said, "the Patton incident revealed a broader problem. Too many of our officers view this war purely through a military lens. They judge our allies solely on battlefield performance and ignore the political consequences. Marshall, ever careful, offered a measured response. Mr. President, combat commanders must focus on operational effectiveness. That is their role. Roosevelt shook his head. No, George, that is only part of it. Commanders at the Army level are political actors, whether they like it or not. They represent the United States. Their words and actions shape diplomatic relationships. They must be taught to understand that. Stimson agreed. I believe you are correct, sir. We have trained our officers in tactics and strategy, but we have not prepared them adequately for the political realities of coalition command. Roosevelt made a decision. Then we will correct that, he said. I want the War Department to develop instruction for senior officers on coalition warfare and diplomatic responsibility before any officer assumes command alongside Allied forces. He will be educated on how to maintain effective political relationships. The directive led to the creation of formal training on coalition operations, programs that would later become standard for senior American commanders. It was a lasting institutional change, born directly from Roosevelt's frustration with George Patton's failure to understand that, in a global war, diplomacy could be as decisive as firepower. In December 1944, Roosevelt received an intelligence report that confirmed his worst fears. Allied intelligence had detected an intensified German propaganda campaign aimed at fracturing the Allied coalition. According to the report, German intelligence had intercepted fragments of American military communications and informal commentary, and was attempting to exploit them to sow mistrust between Allied nations. One passage in particular caught Roosevelt's attention. German propaganda outlets were claiming that senior American generals privately regarded Canadian forces as incompetent and resented being forced to operate alongside them. Roosevelt immediately asked the obvious and troubling question: could this narrative be traced back to Patton's telegrams? The intelligence assessment concluded that the classified messages themselves had not been intercepted. However, it noted that casual remarks, complaints, and informal assessments by American officers, echoing Patton's sentiments, had been overheard, intercepted, or reported by German intelligence and transformed into propaganda. Roosevelt was livid. He summoned Marshall once again. The Germans are using our own prejudices against us, Roosevelt said. They are telling the Canadians that American generals think they are incompetent. That is exactly what Hitler wants, to fracture the alliance from within. Marshall acknowledged the seriousness of the problem. Sir, controlling what individual officers say informally is extremely difficult. Roosevelt agreed, but refused to let the matter rest. Then we control what they say formally, he replied, and we make it unmistakably clear, through public statements and private orders, that disparaging our allies is unacceptable and will be punished. The result was a formal War Department directive issued on December 15, 1944. The order explicitly prohibited disparaging remarks about Allied forces in official communications. It required that assessment of Allied performance be factual, balanced, and professional. Most importantly, it warned that violations would result in relief from command. Patton received the directive immediately and understood that it was aimed primarily at him. His diary entry for December 16th was characteristically bitter. New directive from War Department forbids honest assessment of Allied performance. We are to pretend all forces are equally effective regardless of observed reality. Political correctness now trumps military honesty. This will make winning the war more difficult. But Patton complied. He had no alternative. Roosevelt had made it clear that alliance cohesion was not negotiable. By January 1945, the immediate controversy had faded from public view. Patton focused on battlefield operations. Canadian forces continued their slow, costly advance through the Netherlands. Roosevelt turned his attention increasingly toward the shape of the post-war world. Yet the episode left a lasting impression on the president. It reinforced a lesson he had already learned through hard experience. The gravest threats to coalitions often came not from enemies, but from allies whose frustrations and prejudices went unchecked. After the war, the story of Patton's useless telegrams remained classified for decades. Roosevelt had ordered them sealed, and they stayed sealed. George Marshall's memoirs made no mention of the incident. When Patton's diary was published posthumously, the September 12th entry referencing Roosevelt's letter was heavily edited to remove its context. It was not until the 1970s, when World War II documents began to be systematically declassified, that historians uncovered the telegrams and Roosevelt's response. The discovery prompted a reassessment of Roosevelt's role in managing the Allied coalition. Scholars came to recognize that much of his most important diplomatic work had been conducted quietly, behind the scenes, diffusing tensions, managing egos, and preventing minor disputes from becoming strategic crises. The Patton incident was only one example among many. When Canadian historians learned of the telegrams in the 1970s, the reaction was mixed. Some veterans felt betrayed that an American general they had fought alongside held them in such contempt. Others emphasized a different point. Patton's views had been suppressed, not endorsed. Roosevelt had defended Canada, even at political risk to himself. That distinction mattered. In 1980, the Canadian government formally thanked the Roosevelt family. In a letter to Roosevelt's son, James, Canadian officials acknowledged that Franklin Roosevelt's insistence on proper recognition of Canadian contributions had helped preserve the strength of the alliance, an alliance that continued long after the war ended. American historians who examined the episode drew several enduring lessons. Coalition warfare requires more than military coordination. It demands diplomatic skill and political awareness. Even the most successful battlefield commanders can become liabilities if they fail to understand the political consequences of their words. Presidential leadership is essential in managing military political tensions, and often the most important battles a president fights are the ones that never reach the public eye. Roosevelt's handling of the Patton crisis illustrated all of these truths. He recognized the danger immediately. He acted decisively to contain it. He educated his commanders on the political realities of coalition warfare, and he defended America's allies even when doing so carried political risk. When Dwight D. Eisenhower later reflected on the war, he included a brief but telling observation about Roosevelt's leadership. President Roosevelt understood something many military commanders did not. Coalition warfare is as much about managing relationships as it is about managing battles. He devoted enormous energy to maintaining harmony among allied nations, smoothing disputes, defending each ally against criticism from others, and always emphasizing common purpose over individual grievances. It was a quiet form of leadership, but it helped hold together the alliance that won the war. This political work was as essential to victory as any battlefield campaign. Dwight D. Eisenhower did not refer directly to the Patton telegram incident in his published memoirs, but in private correspondence with friends and colleagues, he acknowledged that Roosevelt had intervened repeatedly during the war to prevent American generals, including Patton, from damaging relationships with British and Canadian forces. FDR understood that we needed every ally we could get, Eisenhower wrote. He would not allow personal prejudices or tactical disagreements to undermine the coalition. He was right to take that position, even when it meant overruling combat commanders. In the larger context of World War II, the Patton telegrams were a minor episode. No public scandal erupted. The Canadian government never learned of them during the war. The alliance held. But for Franklin Roosevelt, the incident was instructive. It reinforced his belief that leading a coalition required constant vigilance against the centrifugal forces of national pride, personal ego, and battlefield frustration. Roosevelt understood that winning the war demanded more than defeating enemy armies. It required sustaining a coalition capable of applying overwhelming force against the Axis powers. Every disparaging remark about an ally, every moment when national arrogance threatened to eclipse shared purpose, weakened that coalition. Preventing such erosion was one of Roosevelt's central responsibilities. He did so through a deliberate pattern of leadership: public praise for allies, private discipline for American commanders who crossed political lines, and relentless education about the realities of coalition warfare. Together, these quiet interventions held the alliance together through the most difficult months of 1944 and 1945. The story of what Roosevelt said when Patton called Canadian soldiers useless is, at its core, a story about leadership. Not battlefield leadership, where Patton excelled, but political leadership, where Roosevelt was unmatched. Roosevelt said publicly and privately that Canadian contributions were essential and deserving of respect. He said that American commanders who failed to show that respect were failing in their duties. He said that political realities sometimes outweighed tactical preferences. And he said, again and again, that preserving the coalition mattered as much as winning battles. These messages, delivered through letters, telegrams, speeches, and private conversations, defined Roosevelt's approach to coalition warfare. They ensured that when victory finally came in May 1945, it came to an alliance that had endured extraordinary strain without breaking. Patton never publicly acknowledged Roosevelt's rebuke. His autobiography, completed shortly before his death in December 1945, made no mention of the episode, but those close to him noticed a change. After September 1944, Patton was noticeably more careful in how he described Allied forces in official communications. He retained his private opinions, but he learned to keep them private. Roosevelt did not live to see the final victory. He died in April 1945, less than a month before Germany's surrender. Yet part of his legacy was a durable alliance with Canada that survived the war and endures to this day, an alliance preserved in no small measure because Roosevelt understood that words matter, that respect must be shown even when performance disappoints, and that political relationships require constant protection. Historians often judge Roosevelt's wartime leadership by his great strategic decisions: prioritizing Europe, demanding unconditional surrender, authorizing the atomic bomb. But his daily unseen labor, managing alliances, disciplining egos, preventing small disputes from becoming existential crises, was equally vital. The Patton telegram incident was one small example of that labor, but it captured Roosevelt's philosophy perfectly. Allies were to be defended, not scapegoated. Commanders were to be educated, not indulged. And the coalition was to be protected, whatever the political cost. In the end, what Roosevelt said when Patton dismissed Canadian soldiers was simple and decisive. No, that assessment is wrong. No, that language is unacceptable. No, you will not undermine our allies. No, political realities do not yield to battlefield frustration. That firm refusal, backed by the threat of relief from command, kept the alliance intact, and keeping the alliance intact helped win the war. That is Franklin Roosevelt's legacy in coalition warfare. Not just the grand strategies, but the 1,000 quiet interventions that prevented the alliance from fracturing. The Patton telegrams were one such moment. They revealed why Roosevelt was not only a wartime president, but a master diplomat, one who understood that victory required not only defeating enemies, but preserving friendships. George Patton was a great battlefield commander who helped win the war. Franklin Roosevelt was a political leader who held together the coalition that made that victory possible. When those two visions collided over Canadian soldiers in September 1944, Roosevelt prevailed, and the coalition survived to achieve victory.